we should start focusing attention on our problems here in the United States. That should be our first priority. Thank you.
I'm going to do all that I can, and I've done all that I can so far, and if at the end of it I'm not successful, then I will have to abide by that. I was not interested in running for president. I was not interested in opposing President Johnson per se. What I was interested in is trying to develop a meaningful policy in Vietnam.
Robert Kennedy brought his presidential campaign to Southern California today.
You here in the state of California might very well decide who's going to be the Democratic nominee and therefore very possibly the next president of the United States.
He campaigned against the war.
The American people want no more Vietnam.
And spoke out for social justice, for black and white, for the poor and disenfranchised.
Every American, no matter what his background, what his creed, what color of his skin, or where he lives, shall walk with dignity and honor in the United States. My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Just minutes later.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Stay back!
He's been shot in the head.
In the head?
He is still alive. That is correct, in the head. They just removed him to the hospital on a stretcher.
Kennedy's death brought shock and grief to the nation. It seemed to be more than we could bear.
What has violence ever accomplished? What has it ever created? No martyr's cause has ever been stilled by an assassin's bullet.
This was the scene at Arlington National Cemetery, Washington, 4.5 years ago. John F. Kennedy, the president, had been torn from life by an assassin's bullet. His brother Robert paid homage to a great man who had set himself so many noble tasks, but whom fate had not allowed to carry them out. Robert Kennedy took up the torch of noble intent. It was extinguished here at the Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles, at the moment of his greatest political triumph. Bobby Kennedy, too, had been gunned down. For 25 hours he clung to life at the Good Samaritan Hospital, a bullet lodged in his brain. Surgeons fought to save him. Waiting crowds prayed. Their prayers echoed throughout the United States, throughout the world. It was unbelievable that such a tragedy could happen twice in the same family. Jackie Kennedy, sister-in-law, widow of the late president, arrived to join the family's bedside vigil. She knew so well the horror of this moment. As the hours ticked away, Senator Robert Kennedy's grasp on life went with them. The man who might have been president of the United States, the father of 10 adored children, a great liberal and humanitarian, had made the same appointment with fate as his brother.
What we're going to do in the rural areas of our country, what we're going to do for those who still suffer within the United States from hunger, what we're going to do around the rest of the globe, and whether we're going to continue the policies that have been so unsuccessful in Vietnam of American troops and American Marines carrying the major burden of that conflict. I do not want to, and I think we should move in a different direction. So I thank all of you who made this possible this evening, all of the effort that you made, and all of the people whose names I haven't mentioned, but who did all of the work at the precinct level, who got out the vote, who did all of the effort, brought forth all of the effort that's required. I was a campaign manager 8 years ago. I know what a difference that kind of an effort and that kind of commitment makes. So I thank all of you, those of you who are here. Mayor Yorty has just sent me a message that we've been here too long already. So my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
So that is in essence where we start at the Ambassador Hotel. Robert Kennedy gives his speech in the embassy room. This happens. What time would you say his speech concludes?
Just about midnight, because the returns were mixed early on, and then it kind of Kennedy had a little lead, and the lead kept growing over the night. So by midnight, his advisors felt it was okay to go down and claim victory. 3 hours earlier, it would have been too soon. But by then, it was very clear that he had won, and the networks were calling it for him. And so he went down. There were 2 elevators that went down, and he went down in one of them, and the press went down in the other. Walked out to the stage, spoke for about 15 minutes, finished his speech, and it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Goes off stage and cuts through this little kitchen pantry area on his way to the print media, because the TV media had him all night. As he gets into this pantry, it's a narrow room. It's about 70 feet long and maybe 3 or 4 feet wide. And he's walking through and shaking hands with the busboys and the kitchen help and some supporters from his campaign who are gathered there. Gets about a third of the way through the room when all of a sudden this young guy pulls a gun and starts firing at him. Kennedy throws his hands up and then is shot and turns and falls to the left. People are screaming. Most people didn't know right away that shots were even been fired. Almost everybody said, I thought it was balloons popping at first because it was so surreal. It just didn't make sense to them. But Kennedy is shot. There seems to be an obvious gunman. Everybody jumps on him and, arrests him. Meanwhile, Kennedy was actually shot 4 times. 5 other people also had bullets in them. All right, 2 bullets stayed in Kennedy because 2 of them went through him. 1 actually went through his coat and not even his body. 1 went through his chest. Another one entered under his arm and lodged in the back of his neck. And then 1 came from like an inch, not more than an inch behind his right ear.
He was standing on the table, and there were approximately 5 or 6 shots. The revolver that was used was a small caliber revolver. I examined the revolver very closely. Rosie Greer had it in his hand after he apprehended the assailant.
Rosie Greer, Kennedy's...
Rosie Greer apprehended the assailant along with several others. There were 5 or 6 people who had him.
Where the small pistol, is that it?
It was a small caliber revolver.
I saw a man pull out a gun. It looked like he pulled it out from his pocket and shot 3 times. I saw all 3 shots hit the senator. Then I saw the senator fall and was picked up, carried away. I also saw the security men pull out their weapons. After then, it was very, very fuzzy.
Carl now has got the gun. He's banging the gun. I'm watching the bullets come out of the gun as every time he hits it, he fires. Goldstein gets hit. What number bullet, I don't remember. He hits me on my right shoulder. I am now falling. But I'm now on the ground. I have Kennedy on my legs. I've got Paul under my left arm, and I've got Goldstein on top of my right shoulder. I'm basically on the bottom of a pile of people. And crying. I was hysterical. When we were on the floor and the shooting was finished, I was on my knees and I crawled over to the senator. First thing he said was, "Is everybody else all right?" I said, don't say anything, just don't speak. All he was concerned with was everybody else. Something I can never forget that. To see a man who knew he was probably going to die, worrying about everybody else.
The suspect is in our custody now. We do not know who he is. He had no identification. He refuses to make a statement of any kind. He does speak and understand English. The gun is in our custody. It's a .22 caliber, 8 shot, and all 8 shots were expended.
Okay, page 17.
Yeah. So Schrade was shot in the forehead. William Wiesel took a bullet in his abdomen. Goldstein was hit in his left hip. Stroll received a bullet in his left shin, and Elizabeth Evans was struck in the head. And a bullet or a big fragment was removed from each of those people.
From each of them. Okay.
Yeah. One of them had actually been shot twice, like
really
through like the pant leg, like they had another bullet hole in them.
Los Angeles police knew the evidence contradicted their version of events. They even filmed a series of reconstructions using witnesses like Carl Yucca. Yucca repeatedly told the police that Sirhan's gun never came within 1.5 feet of Kennedy, and could not therefore have fired the shots which the autopsy showed had killed him. These reconstructions have been kept under lock and key since 1969. LAPD has never acknowledged their existence. A similar set of reconstructions was filmed by the Los Angeles District Attorney with eyewitness Lisa Urso. In them, Urso can be heard placing Sirhan several feet away from Senator Kennedy.
The person who had the gun in their hand was about 3 or 4 feet from the senator, and stopped to shake hands. And at the same time, turned his head, saw fire come out of the gun at about that time.
This film has never been seen before. The district attorney's office has never released it. Immediately after the shooting, the police arrested Sirhan, a young Palestinian. He'd been caught in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel with a smoking gun. Los Angeles Mayor Sam Yorty announced the identity of the assassin.
You that his name appears to be Sirhan, S-A-R-H-A-N, Sirhan. Both names, Sirhan.
With no police guarding the hotel, Sirhan was easily able to slip into the kitchen pantry, concealing a revolver. According to Los Angeles police, as the senator walked through the pantry shaking hands with kitchen workers, Sirhan stepped from beside a steam table and pointed his gun at Kennedy and hotel maitre d' Carl Yucca. Yucca explained what happened next to reporter Ted Chirac in this 1971 film.
In front, yeah. I had him right in front of me. I didn't let him pass me. At that time, I hit one shot. I pushed him down and I put him over the steam table. And here Sirhan keeps on pulling him to the left side. And that's when he starts shooting very rapidly.
5 other people were wounded that night. All had been walking behind Bobby Kennedy through the kitchen pantry. The wounded were taken to the Good Samaritans Hospital in downtown Los Angeles. Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 in the morning of the 6th of June in 1968. Later that morning, scene of crime officers, a police forensics expert, and Los Angeles coroner Thomas Noguchi began a careful examination of the scene of the shooting. The forensics expert was LAPD's chief criminalist, Dwayne Wolfer.
According to all the witnesses, he was the gunman in front of Kennedy. He's the guy that Kennedy saw. He's the reason Kennedy threw his hands up to his face, because Kennedy himself saw Sirhan in front of him. So as Kennedy is like our best witness, but no, he saw the threat right in front of him, put his hands up. But that's not where he was shot from. And in fact, none of the bullets in the pantry from any of the victims, because they were all recovered, all but one, which was somehow lost in the ceiling space because, between there were already like 9 points of entry in the official LAPD story for bullets. Some bullets supposedly went into one person, fell out, bounced and hit the floor, and then hit another victim. I mean, the trajectories are crazy to try and keep it down to 8 bullets. There's at least 3 holes in the ceiling, so they posited that one went up hit the ceiling, came back down, bounced off the floor and hit this woman in the head. And another one just went up into the ceiling and stayed there, and they could never find it again, which is odd because, of course, they completely tore that ceiling apart.
Right.
So if there was a bullet there, they probably would have found it. And maybe they did. The problem is not one of the bullets from that pantry scene, not one from Kennedy or any victim or, any of the other places matched Sirhan's gun. So that's problem number one. Of course, problem number two is that Sirhan's in front of Kennedy, but Kennedy is shot from behind.
A strong clue may be found in the autopsy performed upon the body of Robert Kennedy by L.A. County Coroner Dr. Thomas Noguchi.
In accordance with California law and in a meticulous effort to avert any question or controversy, a painstaking 6-hour autopsy was carried out this morning.
Briefly stated, the autopsy found that the wounds inflicted upon Senator Kennedy were inflicted from behind, at a sharp upward angle, and at extremely close range. Using powder burn analysis, Noguchi determined that the fatal bullet was fired at a distance of about 1 to 3 inches behind the right ear.
Dr. Noguchi, were you able to determine how far the gun muzzle was from Senator Kennedy's head?
One area gunshot wound was found behind the right ear, and there were abundance of a powder deposit on the edge of the right ear, and after test firing the similar weapon, we came to conclusion that the muzzle distance would be a 1 inch from the right ear edge and no more than 3 inches.
So with the autopsy then, so I'm going to go a little bit from your book. This is page 66. At 8:49 a.m., Noguchi removed a bullet from the back of Kennedy's neck. This bullet had not been life-threatening, but was lodged near his spine. The doctors did not need to remove it while Kennedy was still alive. He inscribed this as TN31, and I thought it was really interesting, his initials with the last two numbers of, I guess this would be the autopsy
case,
okay,
case number.
Okay, autopsy. So,
and he said that at the grand jury, so that's how he's like, I always mark my bullets from every autopsy with my initials and the last two digits of the case number.
And really, this is what we want to drive home here. Talk to me about how close the gun that Noguchi anticipated was behind the right ear, how much gunpowder and residue was around the back of the ear, and based off of the test that he did on the, was it pig ears, to see
pig
how
ears,
far the gun splattered. Talk to us about, exactly what that means.
Yes, so to determine how close, I'll pull up my hair here, behind the ear, Kennedy was shot, they look for what they call a stippling pattern of the gunpowder, because at very close range, it'll actually embed in the scalp a little bit. And so they wanted to see how much gunpowder was there, and there was quite a lot of it, indicating the gun had to have been pretty close. And so Noguchi, with Wolfer, by the way, went to a range. Noguchi ordered a bunch of pig's ears, and he had somebody fire, from progressively, further back, from contact range, from not quite contact range. And they kept swapping, new Muslim, new pig's ears in, basically. They did both Muslim and pig's ears to try. And at about 1.5 inches, that was the pattern that Noguchi said that matched. He said could, as close as 1 inch, as far as 3 inches, but if he had to pick just one number, he said about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. So, and what's funny is Wolfer said the same thing for the gunshots under Kennedy's arm. Those weren't made from 3 feet away. Those were made from even closer. He said 1/4 inch, and then he blew it up by a factor of 3 kind of randomly to say 3/4 inch. But you can't change 3/4 inch to 3 feet. You can't. That's ridiculous. So those shots were even closer, and no one talks about that. And I didn't dwell on it in my book, but I actually do think it's an important fact if you're going to do a documentary. But look at that, especially because Wolfer put the gun closer than Noguchi did, and people miss that. That's in the trial transcript. Yeah.
So with those, I hate to belabor this too, but I'm just trying to actually track back these 2 bullets that are inscripted by Nagu. Could we actually see these today? And where
you could go to the archives and see the bullet they have in evidence.
Do you anticipate it would have Dwayne Wolfer's initials on it?
I think you're going to get the DWTN bullet. I do. I think the TN31 bullet is probably lost to history.
Okay.
That's sad, though. That said, there was a special on CBS in 1975 where they brought out the Kennedy neck bullet twice. And one time it looked straight and the other time it looked crooked. Almost as if they had 2 different bullets that are both listed as the Kennedy bullet. And there was a bullet that was bent over like that, but it was one of the victim bullets. It was not the Kennedy bullet.
Right.
But like I said, with CBS interested, you can just bet the conspirators, which would be the CIA, and I say that with great evidence, as you will see in the book, as you have seen in the book, would not let CBS look at something that would give away evidence of conspiracy. Let's put it that way.
In April 1969, Sirhan was convicted. He was sentenced to death. That sentence later reduced to life in prison. Now, Sirhan will be eligible for parole in 1986. When Sirhan was convicted, he was convicted on the evidence. CBS News examined key pieces of that evidence. At the trial of Sirhan, the objects in this room were known more by number than by name. Numbers that added up to, it was said, an open and shut case against the defendant. Trial Exhibit 47, a bullet taken from the body of Robert Kennedy. Exhibit 54, a bullet removed from another victim, William Wiesel. An envelope marked Exhibit 55, test shots. Test shots from this gun, Exhibit 6, a pistol fired by Sirhan. Dry fires very well. This is a close-up view of the bullet removed from the neck of Robert Kennedy. Police expert Dwayne Wolfer testified soon after the shooting that the Kennedy bullet and bullets removed from 2 wounded bystanders, William Wiesel and Ira Goldstein, matched test bullets he said police fired from Sirhan's gun for comparison. Wolfer said that bullets recovered from 3 other wounded bystanders and this fragment removed from the brain of Robert Kennedy were too badly deformed for positive identification. Then 5 years ago, William Harper, an independent firearms specialist, examined bullets in the Kennedy case with a special camera capable of making microscopic photographs. Harper said that Kennedy and Wiesel bullets showed a significant difference in rifling angles, marks imprinted on a bullet as it is forced through the gun barrel. Harper therefore concluded that the 2 bullets had not been fired from the same gun, so there must have been a second gun.
I was called about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, and I was told to report to the Ambassador Hotel. I probably spent 15 or 20 minutes in the pantry area itself. I was walking around, looking at the various locations, trying in my own mind to reenact what took place. During this time, I happened to observe in a wood door frame a center divider between 2 doors, 2 bullet holes. You could clearly see the base of a bullet in each one of those holes. They weren't that deeply embedded, and the wood that was around the holes was freshly broken away.
Bailey's description of the hotel pantry would at first seem to carry no special significance. He went to the scene of a shooting and saw bullet holes. Quite a few others had as well. In fact, photographs were taken of police officials and others pointing proudly to bullet holes in the walls and ceiling. But by the next day, it was known that 5 bullets had been recovered from the 5 wounded bystanders, and that Kennedy had been struck 3 times with another bullet passing through his suit jacket. The problem for the LAPD was that Sirhan's Ivor Johnson .22 caliber pistol held only 8 bullets. Thus, for only a single gun to be firing, there could be no extra bullet holes in the walls and ceiling. With some creative accounting using ricochets, the police managed to make the numbers work. But to do this, the holes in the wood by the doorway, which the night before had been trophies, now became non-entities.
I saw 2 bullet holes in a center divider. I saw 2 bullets in the holes. I know what I saw, and the issue, obviously, is that others say that they weren't there.
But to the chagrin of the LAPD, there was a great body of evidence pointing to the existence of these bullets. Statements from witnesses, statements from police officers, wire service photographs, and most damning of all, clearly labeled FBI photographs which surfaced in 1975, which included close-ups identifying bullet holes in the wood by the doorway. The LAPD, however, continues to claim that the witnesses were mistaken and the photos mislabeled, that the defects in the wood were only nail holes.
That's ridiculous. I was there. They were positively bullet holes. Anyone who is saying anything different either didn't see the holes the way I did, or they have some other agenda.
As far as extra bullets are concerned, why not settle the matter by a scientific examination of the door frames and the ceiling tiles? Well, this is not possible because as it was revealed in 1975, not only had the door frames and the ceiling tiles been removed by the police the night of the murder, they had been secretly destroyed in June of 1969.
On April 19th, 1988, the chief archivist for the California State Archives makes a stunning announcement.
As the documents show, the police did dispose of physical evidence, the door jambs and ceiling tiles from the crime scene. Among missing photographic items are those relating directly to crime scene studies, ballistics examinations, and witness reenactments.
The official explanation offered was that these items were too large to be kept in a filing cabinet. Thus, in one of the most important murder investigations in the nation's history, the Los Angeles police asked us to believe that a few pieces of wood and several ceiling tiles were too much trouble to store away.
I mean, the bullet fragments from the brain came in first and ended up in 2 vials, which is also kind of interesting because they're small enough to all fit in one. So why were they in 2 separate vials? And there is some evidence in the record that maybe there were 2 head shots, which would explain 2 vials. Oh. Somebody must have realized the issue right away because those 2 numbers in evidence were almost immediately whited out and written over with some other evidence. And they were shoved down the list a little bit. Very odd. And I've talked to, whenever I get a chance and I talk to an LAPD officer, I never tell them who I am or what I'm writing about. I just ask questions like, if somebody turns something into evidence, do they ever change the number? He's like, no, of course not. That's the whole point. And I'm like, okay. And some of the bullets were turned in like more than 24 hours later. And I thought that was very suspicious. So I asked, some cops, and they're like, oh, no, you turned the evidence in right away. That's important. I said, well, let's say it's like a big O.J. Simpson type thing. What if it's a really big public case? Is there any chance the evidence could come in that late? And he's like, no, something like that. It would just go in right away. And you would never like turn it in and then it actually gets logged a day later. They log it while you're standing there. And so I find that very interesting. So the Thomas Noguchi bullet, when it went into evidence, it had the TN-31 on its base. Now, years later, in 1975, because there were so many questions raised, there was a film made called The Second Gun, which raised the question of how could Sirhan have fired all these bullets? And so a panel was allowed to examine only the bullet evidence. They weren't allowed to call witnesses or look into the case in any other aspect. They were only to look at the bullet evidence, which was, of course, provided to them by the LAPD and the county, 2 of the people involved in the cover-up. And the panel looked at the bullet out of Kennedy's neck, but it didn't say TN-31 on it. It said GWTN.
Oh, my God.
And when I first saw this, I'm like, they wouldn't forge bullets. That's cheating. They wouldn't do that. But that's exactly what they did. And not only that, since that time, where I had that first mental hurdle I have to get over. I found it's so common that if you're a public defender in LA or a volunteer, as you can be, to the public defender's office, they have a pamphlet, and that's one of the techniques in there. Make sure the police didn't forge the bullets, because it's a common practice.
Any evidence of additional shots would confirm that multiple shooters were involved, because the capacity of the so-called Sirhan revolver was 8 shots. Previously undisclosed FBI photographs confirmed there were bullet holes in the pantry door frames. These were circled by an LA Sheriff's Department deputy. The FBI labeled these as bullet holes.
This is from your book, page 82, and I think this will set us up to kind of understand how, when you're examining these bullets, it's not a thing where it's like a guess. It's almost like a fingerprint or something. And I'm gonna, again, from your book, this is page 82. Wolfer is describing how a particular bullet came from a particular gun. And I'll just try to do a synopsis of this. In the barrels of the rifling of the weapon, there's what we call imperfections, which scratch the bullet as they cross these imperfections. These imperfections produce in the bullet series of valleys and ridges, which we call striation marks. And this is, again, I think this will set us up going right into the discussion of the gun. Because basically when Wolfer does these tests with the gun and the bullets trying to match, this is how he's trying to establish essentially that there is a connection from the Noguchi autopsy bullets that were in Kennedy to Sirhan's gun. However, before we set that up, I've got to ask you, with the gun, what was turned into evidence officially? When was that turned into the LAPD? And then we can kind of go to the test that Wolfer did, and we can talk about, examining that. Right. But first of all, basically, to make it simple, who turned in the gun and when?
Rafer Johnson turned in the gun the morning after the shooting. And by the morning after the shooting, I mean later in the morning, because, of course, Kennedy was shot right after midnight, about 12:15 a.m., give or take a minute or two. And Rafer Johnson had been one of the people who was tackling Sirhan and holding him down, and Rosie Greer got the gun out of Sirhan's hand, gave it to Rafer and said, hold on to that. But the LAPD records don't show a gap. According to them, Rafer followed Kennedy to the hospital and was with him, and that's where the police got the gun from him. So very possibly that's exactly what happened.
With the gun, we did the little backstory there of how it was turned in by Rafer Johnson. Wolfer gets it. He goes and immediately do tests. Tell us real quick, the test he did, how did that work? Did he use bullets?
So Wolfer fired. Yeah, Wolfer took Sirhan's gun, when it was turned into evidence, which was almost immediately, because like I said, it was taken from him, and then they got it from Rafer at the hospital and went right back to LAPD. And first thing Wolfer would do is fire it into a barrel to create test bullets. And I believe he said he fired 8 bullets, but only retrieved 7 of them. Now you're shooting into kind of like a barrel of water. Where else would the bullet go? And he's like, sometimes the bullets just get lost. That doesn't make any sense. And again, this is where like critical thinking comes in. It's like, if it bounced out, you would know. It's like Wolfer kept a bullet, and he probably kept it hoping to switch it, with some other bullet somewhere along the way, not realizing he'd have to switch 2 bullets. So he had these bullets. He turned the gun and 4 of the bullets into the grand jury the very next day, which would be June 7th. Kennedy was shot after midnight on the 5th. He won the primary on the 4th, shot after midnight on the 5th, died, about 1:48 a.m. on the 6th. And then on June 7th was the grand jury.
Okay.
So very, very little time to find any evidence of conspiracy or to understand what was going on. But I do want to go back that as soon as Wolfer got the first bullet in, that's when he knew there was a problem. Because the first bullet obviously didn't match Sirhan's gun. When he couldn't match the first bullet, that's the bullet that doesn't enter the record then. It's like originally entered as like evidence number 1, and then later shows up as like, evidence 121 or something. It's almost like it's turned into evidence, doesn't match, so it's disappeared, and a new bullet enters in its place, like, a day and a half later. So that's a little weird. That's basically the cycle. So it's clear that Wolfer knew there was a problem. So as soon as Wolfer gets that Kennedy bullet on June 6th, he fired test bullets, and then the gun went right to the grand jury.
Right.
Yeah. So he did not have Sirhan's gun to dummy up bullets with, or you can bet that's what he would have done.
That's why he had the problems.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Wolfer said, so I went to look for a test gun that would be very similar, and I found one with a very close serial number. That night, he took a photo of the wrong bullet, the one that said DWTN, and what he claimed was a test bullet from Sirhan's gun, which was not. It was just another victim bullet, and a fake victim bullet at that. He took 2 fake bullets, made a photo that night, and put it away, and made sure no one in the department talked about it. And there's a memo to this effect. When Allard Lowenstein, the congressman, started looking into the case, the LAPD, wrote a memo saying, we do have this secret photo, and if there is a reexamination of the bullet evidence, that's when we're gonna, bring it out. But we don't want to bring it out in advance because a conspiracy theorist might see things in it, and which is kind of exactly what happened. Once the photo was revealed, we realized it was a photo. The panel thought, they were told that it was the Kennedy neck bullet versus a test bullet from Sirhan's gun. And then the panel said, no, it was the Kennedy neck bullet versus the Goldstein bullet, one of the other victims. And in fact, neither bullet ever came from the crime scene. They weren't logged into evidence because DWTN was not a bullet ever logged into evidence. And the mark on the Goldstein bullet, it had no marking, but it should have had an X on the base because the doctor who removed the bullet from Goldstein put an X on it, and that's in the record. And then when it was logged into evidence, the X was noted, and later it shows up with a 6 at the panel. Well, it's kind of hard to turn an X into a 6. What do you do with the top part of it? So it's not even like it was the same bullet and they marked over it. It's a different bullet.
Wow.
And so the panel that us taxpayers in LA County paid for was completely bogus because they weren't even looking at the actual bullets from the crime. Every single bullet they examined had a problem with its chain of evidence. And so no surprise, none of them matched Sirhan's gun because they hadn't come from Sirhan's guns. But in fact, they had to go to this elaborate charade and dummy up a whole bunch of bullets and make sure they all came from the same gun, just not Sirhan's gun.
And this is another important point in your book that we'll get into as well. The bullets that they pulled from Kennedy in this autopsy did not match the bullets that they pulled from the victims that were shot, correct?
Originally. Now, this is before, if we assume the bullets were switched at some later point, because there was another criminalist from Pasadena who had a very good reputation, unlike Dwayne Wolfer, and his name was Bill Harper. And he looked at the bullets in evidence about 13 times. He went several times to the county clerk because you could go there and sit and look at the evidence and, touch it. And of course, being a criminalist, they trusted him. He's obviously no motive to, do anything bad to the bullets. And he claimed they had different groove markings and that the bullets didn't even match each other.
Oh my God.
My problem has been that I've never been able to find out which bullets he looked at. Did he look at the DWTN or did he look at TN31? And I'm just not clear on that. But my strong suspicion is he saw the real TN31 bullet and a real victim bullet, and that's why they didn't match.
Okay.
And years later, of course, the bullets were found to match, and Harper had just been mistaken because he was looking at black and white photos and not color photos. No, that's a lie. He examined them in person. It's like people make up the silliest excuses to explain things away, and what's sad is other researchers fall for it and believe it, without doing the critical thinking. And it's like he held it in his hand. He counted the grooves by hand. He wasn't going from photos.
I've got H58725, and then underneath
H58 is the one that he used at the trial.
Okay.
And I believe Wolfer used to dummy up the bullets. That's the one I think, if that gun were ever found, I bet they would match the ones the panel looked at.
Okay, perfect. So no, but this is a very, 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 very important point. Tell us the difference between the gun that was presented at trial and the gun that was Sirhan's that was recovered by Rayford Johnson at the scene.
So two identical guns, same manufacturer, same make, same model. At the trial, Wolfer held up a gun and said, "I swear that these bullets came from this gun and no other gun." And it's very possible that he was telling the truth because he had used this gun, which did not belong to Sirhan, to make the bullets that he was turning into evidence. And when I first saw that gun number, it was so close to the other one that I thought, is that a typo? But as I kept reading the whole trial transcript, later in his testimony, he comes back to that and goes, "I was so happy to find a gun with a very close serial number." And then a bell went off in my head. And then I found like 2 or 3 other pieces of evidence. Sirhan's lawyers knew it wasn't the same gun and didn't challenge it. This guy had his lawyers sold him down the river, and Sirhan's own lawyer was in trouble with the law. So it's clear that a much darker sentence was being held over his head. And then when he did their bidding, that was his reward. And as I mentioned at the end of that chapter on the trial, everybody involved in the trial that sunk Sirhan got rewarded. All of them got promoted up the chain for keeping the lid on the lie.
And I think that's really going to be illuminated when we go through the trial. We can certainly touch on some of the transcripts, but you mentioned a great thing there. You said the lawyers knew that this serial number was not the same as...
There's a letter, and I believe it's on Lynn Mangan's site at SirhanResearchers.com. But it's like Cooper basically saying, it looks like Wolfer brought the wrong gun to the trial or something. And again, I don't think it's an accident because he looked for a gun with a very close serial number, and 53725 and 58725 are very close. They're off by 1 digit. And here's why I think he went to great lengths to do that, because this goes back to the bullet striations. If Sirhan's gun had a particular mark in it, you'd want to find a gun barrel that came off the assembly line very close to that one, so that it might too have the same defect. Things happen, and so you would think if there's some strange thing that happened in Sirhan's gun barrel, it might have happened in the gun barrels right before and after it. And so it does make sense that, because that was the other thing the 1975 panel found. They said there are markings on the bullet that are similar, but they're not similar enough for us to say that they match Sirhan's gun.
Oh my goodness.
And so I think this was deliberate. And like I said, the fact that Wolfer made a photo of 2 fake bullets on the night of June 6th that wasn't used till 1975, he knew the day Kennedy died that this was a conspiracy, that Sirhan was not responsible. And all he did is frame up evidence to tell the story that his superiors wanted him to tell.
I really think in the trial we'll dive into the corruption and the LAPD, because we can stop pretending like these are all accidents and this was, somebody misshuffled evidence. This is all intentional. And again, you've made this point before. It doesn't mean that every single LAPD officer was in the cut. Just the important ones. You have Wolfer, you've got Sergeant Pena, and you've got Sergeant Hernandez. Those, to me, are the big dogs.
And I retracted my statements about we shot him to they shot him. I never was interviewed. I never contradicted my first 2 statements. But nevertheless, apparently they thought that the reports would not be scrutinized or subject to scrutiny. What they didn't count on, I guess, was the fact that I'd kept one of the reports myself, the original stencil copy.
But disappearing reports and canceled APBs were not the only oddities the evening of June 4th.
We lost complete radio communication for a period of 40 to 45 minutes. Something was very strange that never happened before. At present, there's no question in my mind that elements of the CIA were involved. Two of the officers, Lieutenant Pena and Hank Hernandez, and the LAPD had retired some years before and gone to work for a government agency that was later found to be front for the CIA. And then almost as if by magic, they showed up and were at the emergency control center within a very short time after the assassination.
It's really interesting that Manny Pena is the one trying to shut that avenue down, because he's also the one that's directly connected to the CIA. And he was also the choke point of the investigation. There's a flow chart that shows kind of the routing of information through SUS. And it starts at this desk, and then it goes here, and then it goes here. And at some point it gets to Manny Pena's desk. And he has sole authority to determine what got further, investigated and what got shut down. And he had worked for AID, the Agency for International Development, which is a well-known CIA cover agency providing cover to the CIA. And also, his brother was on TV saying how much Manny Pena enjoyed his years of service to the CIA. So it's pretty well established that, he's not just an LA police officer, he's a CIA operative. So it's very interesting that he would be in the catbird seat regarding the investigation of Robert Kennedy.
But in the course of my JFK assassination research, one day at the public library in downtown Los Angeles, I pulled out the wrong drawer. It was right next to the one I should have been pulling out. And there were all these microfilm reels from the Los Angeles Police Department's investigation of the Robert Kennedy files. And it was 1992, and I knew that the files had only been released in 1988. And I'm like, wow, they've only been out for 4 years. I bet you I'll find something on them that no one else has found. Well, years later, I found a lot of stuff that no one else has found, because I've been literally reading the files ever since. I started on microfilm when the files were ultimately digitized and put online. I, continued reading there. But I was fascinated by the original records more than other people's book accounts. I really wanted to see for myself how it unfolded. All right, and the facts that I was finding did not match the official story. In fact, the very first reel that I put in the first set of files were some witnesses talking about a second guy apprehended at the hotel that night. And I'm like, what? There was somebody else besides Sirhan? And they're like, yeah, this guy was handcuffed and taken out. I'm like, well, who was that? And his name was Michael Wayne. And it turns out Michael Wayne is a very, very, very interesting character. I don't think he was a shooter, but I think he was definitely involved.
I recall saying they're getting away, or something very similar to that, meaning that I felt that they were part of whoever it was at the time that was shooting the senator.
The most persuasive witness was Sandy Serrano. She gave her account in a television interview less than an hour after the shooting. She would be browbeaten by the Los Angeles Police Department and has never spoken out since.
Came running down the stairs and said, "We've shot him, we've shot him." And I says, "Who did you shoot?" And she says, "We shot Senator Kennedy."
In the weeks that followed, Serrano was questioned repeatedly by police. Her phone rang constantly. Her house was broken into. On June 20th, Serrano was told to come down to headquarters and asked to submit to a polygraph test given by Sergeant Enrique Hernandez, the same Hank Hernandez that Sergeant Schraga complained had so mysteriously returned from overseas employment. Although almost all tapes of witness interviews were lost or destroyed by the LAPD, a tape of Serrano's session has somehow survived. The interview begins in a normal enough fashion. Hernandez explains that the LAPD desires to conduct a thorough investigation and wants to leave no stone unturned. He asks Serrano several different times whether she was telling the truth about the night of the murder. Serrano answers in the affirmative. But then the formal questions end and the session takes a very strange turn.
Sandy, I'm not going to ask you any more questions. Not a single one. All right. Okay, here's the thing. You're an intelligent young girl. You know that for some reason this was made up. So here's what you have to think about right now is that I think you owe it to Senator Kennedy, the late Senator Kennedy, to come forth, be a woman about this. If he, and you don't know, and I don't know whether he's a witness right now in this room watching what we're doing in here, don't shame his death by keeping this thing up. I have compassion for you. I want to know why I want to know why you did what you did. This is a very serious thing.
I've seen those people.
No, Sandy. Remember what I told you about that? You can't say you saw something when you didn't see it. Sandy, look, I can explain this to the investigators where you don't even have to talk to them, and they won't talk to you. But please, in the name of Kennedy,
I don't want to name of Kennedy. I'm going to get this.
if you know that this is wrong, Sandy, you know that this is wrong. You might want to be pushing it off with a smirk on your face, with a smile, but you know that deep inside what you have done.
I remember seeing a girl.
No, I'm talking about what you have told here about saying a person tell you we have shot Kennedy, and that's wrong. No, it isn't, Sandy. Please, don't mind the house. Look, I love this man, and you're saying he right now, he can't even. Well, I'm trying not to shout, but this is a very emotional thing with me too, you see. Are you afraid right now, Sam? Are you afraid?
I don't like this.
I know you don't.
I'm afraid. I just don't like it.
No, you're afraid.
Berating her, badgering her, thinking of little tricks to throw her off.
Well, he put words in her mouth. He literally put the words in her mouth. And she finally broke down under the intense pressure.
As we begin to hear from these edited excerpts, Hernandez is giving a solo rendition of Good Cop, Bad Cop, showing a patronizing concern for Serrano on the one hand and menacing her in subtle ways on the other. Serrano, one must remember, was merely a witness. She was not a person accused of a serious crime, clinging to a flimsy story with the hope of escaping punishment. She had no reason to invent such a story, but more important, the LAPD's own All Points Bulletin, from a separate source, describes the very people and the conversation Serrano was reporting. Nevertheless, Hernandez keeps attacking. The promise is that if she changes her story, the questioning will end. The threat is to publicly denounce her as a liar and to continue the interrogations.
Well, there was this girl coming. She was coming downstairs and she said, we shot. No, this girl in a polka dot dress, a white dress, polka dot. And
Don't. It's like a disease. I know what I'm telling you.
it said I never even seen a girl with a polka dot dress.
I'm saying that nobody told you we have shot Kennedy.
If somebody told me that we had shot.
No.
I'm sorry, but that's true. That is true.
Look, one of these days you're going to be 27 years old, 28 years old. What kind of a person?
It's a whole mess of things.
What's that going to be?
Well, it's too messed up. Even I can't even remember what happened anymore.
Well, number one, you know that nobody told you we had shot Kennedy.
No, somebody told me we had shot Kennedy.
No, nobody told you. Where did they tell you this, Sandy?
Outside.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sandy, like I say, don't be.
Well, I'm not going to say I truly believe somebody told me, and I'm not going to say nobody told me just to satisfy anybody else.
No, just the truth to satisfy yourself. No one else. Yeah. To satisfy the family, the remaining family of this. The Kennedys have had nothing but tragedy here since the first President Kennedy, now Senator Bobby Kennedy. Now what next?
And this is just kind of just to set us up a little bit. And again, if you kind of think of like true crime, Dateline in that ilk, you know, a lot of times we're setting up the scene, you're kind of seeing who different people are, and then you go forward and you can start parceling out who you think did what. But for now, I just kind of wanted to get everybody in, you know, kind of establish what the scene looked like. And again, this will be great for our later discussion. But if you could close with just a brief description about Thane Eugene Cesar, I think it might be relevant just to introduce him into the scene.
So we know that Kennedy was shot from under the right arm. We also know who was standing right next to Kennedy, holding his elbow with his left hand and having a gun exposed in his right hand, who would have been in the perfect position to shoot Kennedy under the arm in a way that no one could see, because this particular man was also over 6 feet tall and kind of husky. So he could literally use his own body as a shield to hide the shooting of Kennedy. Now, he would have been more exposed for a headshot, but for the underarm shot, he's my best guess, and his name is Thane Eugene Cesar. He was a security guard from an outside company. The Ambassador Hotel had its own brown-suited security guards who worked for the ambassador, but they expected overflow crowds. And so they asked Ace Security, a separate company, to bring in some extra help. But they had gray uniforms. So we know when somebody sees a guard in a gray uniform versus a brown uniform, we know if it's Ace versus Ambassador Hotel. Okay. Caesar was also working, his main job was working as supposedly a plumber at Lockheed's Skunk Works facility, where they're building the CIA's planes, the U-2 and other things. So he had security clearance. He also was, I found out later, working for the Howard Hughes organization for Mayhew. Actually, separately, I found out he had worked with Mayhew at Bel Air Security, a private security firm for the Bel Air community right next to Beverly Hills. And that security firm was set up by Robert Mayhew and one of his associates, who evidently employed Caesar there. And that's very interesting because, again, remember, Mayhew is the guy the CIA hired to kill Castro. Mayhew is an assassination plotter. He must have had previous successes, or the CIA wouldn't have turned to him to kill Castro. You don't pull some novice businessman off the street and say, hey, come up with a plan to kill Castro. Right. You find the guy who's pretty good at getting that done. In fact, that's why Hughes hired him. He hired him as an assassin to fix his issues. And it looks like Mayhew killed one of the guys courting one of the women that Hughes was interested in. So, he has a history, so if Caesar's associated with him, that's in itself suspicious. Now, there are lots of databases online and called public aggregator databases. You can look people up and see where they've worked, where they've lived. Over the years, I'd put Caesar in and nothing, had showed up because there weren't a lot of records when I first started researching. But the last time I looked was stunning because I went in at least 3 different services, and all 3 had him listed as a contract agent of the CIA. So I wrote one of them, it's like, where do you get your there's no chance this just comes from like scraping the internet or looking in forums or hearsay. And they're like, not a chance. It comes from loan documents, house mortgage information, car, very credible, solid information.
If we follow the paths of the bullets that struck Robert Kennedy, they seem to point not to Sirhan, but to an assassin directly behind and to the right of the senator. Though the police initially claimed that there were no other guns drawn in the pantry, there was a person directly behind Robert Kennedy, to his right, with a gun drawn.
Getting up off the floor, he had his weapon out.
Suspicion directed at Thane Eugene Caesar, an employee of Ace Security Service, is not new. It was the central thesis of Ted Chirac's groundbreaking 1973 film documentary, The Second Gun. According to his own testimony, Caesar was a last-minute recruit for duty at the Ambassador that night. He had worked for Ace for less than a week. Caesar has admitted that he had his gun drawn that night, but he says he never fired it. But another witness, journalist Don Schulman, claimed to a radio reporter immediately after the murder that he saw Caesar fire his gun.
Just then the guard who was standing behind Kennedy took out his gun, and he fired also. Well, I didn't see everything that happened that night because of the blinding lights and the people screaming, but the things that I did see, I'm sure about. And that is Kennedy being shot 3 times. The guard definitely pulled out his gun and fired.
Did you see any security guards in that kitchen pantry?
There was a security man somewhere behind me. I don't know how far away from me.
On what side?
I somewhere around right on the left side, right behind Kennedy, somewhere around there.
We also know, I found this in the files recently, that various parts of the hotel were guarded by different guards. Thane Eugene Caesar was one of several guards hired by the hotel through Ace Security. Ace Security had like 8 or 10 guys there that night. And different guards were being very good at their posts and checking people's ID and only letting certain people in. But for whatever reason, the kitchen was constantly unguarded, and one of the Kennedy staffers is complaining to the police in the files about how she had to keep shooing people out of the kitchen. No one was supposed to be there except press people, or certainly Robert Kennedy and his immediate, attendants. But the person who was charged with guarding the kitchen door was Thane Eugene Caesar. So, I mean, if you wanted to have a guy, in there to make sure Sirhan got into the room, because frankly, if your patsy doesn't get in the pantry, the whole plot is off, right? You got to get him into the pantry, and the only way to do that is to make sure whoever's guarding the room is going to let him in. So I find it really interesting that St. Eugene Caesar was the guard stationed at the kitchen that night.
When I got to the police station, I noticed I lost my tie, and I figured, I figured when I got knocked down, when it got knocked off. Also, when they took me back to the hotel, I went into the kitchen area, and the sheriff was still there. There was 3 or 4 men there. They were looking for bullets. And I definitely wouldn't have voted for Bobby Kennedy because he had the same ideas as John did, and I think John sold the country down the road. He gave it to the commies. He gave it to whoever he wanted to. He literally gave it to the minority. He says, "Here, this is it. You take over. I'm giving it to you. You run the white man. Nobody should be run. I'm not saying that the white should be the slave of the black or the black the slave of the white, but he turned the pendulum too far the other way."